This is Left Voices for Thursday, February 20th, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
prisoners have a right to respect for their dignity and for their human rights, and this pushes the state one step closer to being a place that respects prisoners' human rights.
New York State agrees to reform its use of solitary confinement. The state of New York and lawyers from the New York Civil Liberties Union have announced that the state's Department of Community Corrections will make significant changes to its policies on placing and keeping prisoners in solitary confinement. Every day, approximately 3,800 New York State prisoners are held in special housing units known as SHU. A 2012 NYCLU study found that the average period of confinement in SHU in New York State is 150 days, 5 to 10 times longer than what experts say is the maximum tolerable span. The NYCLU filed a class action lawsuit, Peoples versus Fischer, challenging the practice. The agreement, announced Wednesday, suspends legal action in that suit as reform recommendations are developed. The state will take some immediate steps to remove youth, pregnant women, developmentally disabled, and intellectually challenged prisoners from isolation, and the use of solitary as a disciplinary measure against prisoners younger than 18 will be prohibited. Human rights experts worldwide consider solitary confinement to be a form of torture. And Elena Landriscina, a fellow at the NYCLU and one of the lawyers in the lawsuit, says it is a form of abuse that has been imposed for months and years at a time.
Prisoners who are held in isolation are confined to their cell generally 23 hours a day. When we published our report, Boxed In October 2012, we documented that the average length of a sentence is around 5 months, but actually many prisoners spend longer periods of time because they have consecutive sentences. So an individual will be in 23 hours of lockdown for days or weeks or months, and those conditions are very stark. They don't have phone calls. They have very limited personal possessions with them in their cell. So it's very isolating and psychologically and physically harmful to people who are held for such prolonged periods of time.
In fact, some are held for years in solitary. A couple of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit were held for more than 2 years.
Right. Leroy Peoples, who's the first individual who filed this lawsuit, he served 780 days in isolation.
What is the legal standard, or is there a legal standard for the use of solitary as a form of punishment?
The Corrections Department has disciplinary policies, and one of the disciplinary sanctions that they impose, which they have authority to under the administrative regulations in New York, is disciplinary confinement. So that's the source of authority for disciplinary segregation within the state system.
But the disciplinary segregation has applied to nonviolent prisoners. Is there a justification for that?
We don't believe that disciplinary segregation should be imposed for nonviolent offenses, given the risk of harm. Even for more serious offenses, there's a lot of research and authority out there about how harmful it is and how counterproductive isolation is. So for even individuals who represent a challenge and may have chronic behavioral issues, the research that is out there says that there should be intervention and treatment, not just segregation and discipline in these really punitive and harmful conditions.
And I understand that more than 2,000 prisoners a year have been released directly from isolation back to the community. How does this affect their chances of survival outside of the corrections environment?
It definitely makes the challenge of re-entering their community significantly harder. There's a study that was done within the Washington State Corrections Department, which documented how increased rates of recidivism are linked to isolation and segregation. So there's a significant challenge that any individual who's returning to their community faces, and we think that that's exacerbated by the straight release from really dramatic isolation to the community and to the street.
Beyond removing youth, pregnant inmates, and developmentally and intellectually disabled prisoners from isolation units, what else has the state agreed to do under this agreement?
New York has committed to making some modest, though meaningful, changes to conditions of isolation at several of the men's prison facilities. And that consists of an increase in recreation, some more study packets which prisoners can use and read while they're in their cells, and some headphones. So they're very modest changes, but they're meaningful to individuals who are in isolation. The agreement also starts to revise and make changes to disciplinary policies. And most significantly, the state is going to be implementing sentencing guidelines, which for the first time create maximum sentence lengths for each infraction. And in addition to that, the agreement also establishes a framework for two corrections experts that the plaintiffs have retained and the state has retained for them to review and analyze the system and come up with recommendations which we hope will be incorporated and used to create more reforms in the future.
This was an agreement. This was not a settlement through litigation. What's New York State's obligation to live up to this agreement? And if they fall short, what are the consequences?
The state is entering into this agreement and proposing to make all of these changes voluntarily, which means that the recourse that we as the plaintiffs would have if they don't undertake these changes is really to return to litigation. So if after months of negotiations we find that the state hasn't been in compliance with the agreement, then we can return to litigation. Or if we engage in negotiations and after many months can't reach an agreement and we've exhausted good faith efforts to reach that agreement, then we would also have the ability to return to litigation.
And how does this place New York State in the general respect for prisoners' rights as far as isolation goes among other states and internationally?
The changes that New York State is going to be undertaking, I think, places New York at the forefront of many of the efforts that states have undertaken in recent years to make conditions more humane and more in line with human rights standards. Under human rights law, prisoners have a right to respect for their dignity and for their human rights, and this pushes the state one step closer to being a place that respects prisoners' human rights.
Elena Landriscina is a legal fellow with the New York Civil Liberties Union. This has been Left Voices for Thursday, February 20th, 2014. Join us again tomorrow for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andreas Sears for leftvoices.net.